A World Bank report found that South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. We speak to Pierella Paci. She's from the World Bank about this after the break. Do stay with us.
For Ukraine to be able to talk to Russia, it would have to withdraw its request to join the NATO military alliance.
NATO allies have been sending weapons to Ukraine, they've been sending field hospital, military assets, equipment, but they will not be sending their troops because Ukraine is not a member.
The West is seeing this move by Russian President Vladimir Putin as an attempt to destabilize things in Europe.
This is a brutal act of war. Our thoughts are with the brave people of Ukraine.
Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically.
There has been a big push to find a diplomatic solution.
Perhaps more pressure then on China to start to lean more towards being more critical of Russia in the coming days.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia.
The United Nations Security Council, they are the ones who should be getting more and more engaged in a mediation process, and one does not see that happening.
This conflict really in the region has caused a bit of panic within the Baltic states, the Balkan states as well. So really the entire Europe as well and the world is watching keenly.
The World Bank released a report on inequality in Southern Africa, an assessment of the Southern African Customs Union. The report found that the SACU region, which consists of Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia and South Africa, is the world's most unequal region, although they note that inequality is the worst in Namibia and South Africa. So why, after decades of independence, are these countries grappling to improve the lot of their people, and what are the solutions? I'm joined now by Pierella Paci. She is from the World Bank. Thank you very much for joining us, Pierella. What criteria does the World Bank study look at when determining the levels of inequality and poverty?
Thanks very much for having me, first of all. And that's a really interesting question, because of course there is very different ways in which we could measure inequality and poverty. This particular report and the World Bank more generally actually looks at monetary aspect of poverty and inequality. So although we also look at some other factors, we mostly focus on income. And because it's often difficult to measure income of individuals and especially of households, sometimes and mostly we actually consider consumption as a proxy for income. So we do that both to measure inequality, and we measure inequality with reference to a particular line, which we consider to be the minimum requirement that a household needs to have in order to live a decent life, minimum living standards. And that poverty line varies from country to country, sometimes at national level, sometimes there is a global measure that we also use just to compare across the countries across different parts of the world. And that we had different poverty lines depending on the level of income of the countries. Most SACU countries, with the exception of Lesotho, are middle-income countries, what we consider middle-income countries. So the poverty line we usually use for them is 190, and then we work $190 a day, and then we use higher poverty lines depending on the issue. For inequality, we use the same variables, so the consumption of household, and then we do like a distribution of that, looking at who is the bottom, who is the top, who is the better off, who are the worse off, and we use in this report a number of different indicators, mostly the Gini coefficient, which is a worldly sort of long-term recognized indicator.
So these countries are endowed with mineral resources and young people. What do you think are the impediments to the average standard of living rising in these countries? Is it politics?
It's interesting. I wouldn't say, politics are quite separate things. So in a way, it's always a major determinant. I actually think that inequality is one of the main impediments to actually these countries achieving the full potential in terms of utilizing the full resources, both, as you say, people, but also the resources they have, the natural resources they have. We talk about the sort of value of people in terms of human capital. We talk about the natural resources in terms of natural capital. And you also have a lot of natural capital in terms of beautiful environment and so on. So, as you point out, all these countries have a lot of it. I think, unfortunately, it's so unequally distributed, especially in terms of the human capital and the resources available for people, that the individuals don't actually achieve the full potentials. And individuals are also workers. Individuals are also sort of potential enterprises. So, and unfortunately, the ability does not depend on your original characteristic. It tends to be randomly allocated between different people. And if you sort of basically prevent some people and a large proportion of your people from actually fulfilling the full potential, in a way that you're already constraining yourself from achieving your full potential as a country, your full growth potential. And I think a good example of a success story in that respect, I think, relatively speaking, is Botswana. Because Botswana actually, the report shows very clearly, has actually been probably the only country, and Lesotho did reasonably well too, but for different reasons. But amongst the SACU countries, Botswana is the only country that significantly reduced inequality over the period that we analyzed. And they really did so by leveraging their natural capital and using, but that means the natural resources, and investing more in the people, so that now they also have a higher level of skills, and the people there are what we economists talk about productivity, higher level of productivity. They also use some of that capital to invest in infrastructure, so basically in sort of other form of capital. And I think that's shown, at least for a long time, also in growth. Then I think there have been other factors that sort of slow down growth, but definitely in terms of reduction in inequality. Other countries are not being quite so effective. And I think, again, the fact that some people are prevented from birth from achieving their own potential, and then those disadvantages get accumulated as they reach the labor market, is in itself a reason for actually not achieving full potential.
Yeah. So you've cited Botswana as a good example of a country that's making progress. But generally speaking, what are the World Bank's recommendations about how to deal with these inequalities and the poverty seen in these countries?
So thank you. That's a really interesting question. And there is not really magic bullet. I think, as the report points out, inequality tends to be very sticky. And I think the governments of these countries, all of them, are trying to address the issue. And honestly, also the period in which the new governments have been in place is reasonably short. So it's a very hard problem, and I think we need to acknowledge that. But the report is very clear in showing that there are basically three really important levels of inequalities that combine. The first one is what we call the inequality of opportunities, which basically means that children at birth, or even before the birth, face very different circumstances, and that is going to affect their livelihood to then become productive and join the labor market. That obviously is what everybody generally agrees is an unfair allocation of resources, and basically it's very high inequality. It's what we call inequalities of opportunity. To address that, we suggest that really what needs to be done is to have more inclusive, high quality service delivery. And that would just be the only way of sort of leveling the playing field for everybody. How do you do that? Well, these countries actually spend already a lot of money into things like basically social services, health education, social protection, and they've done reasonably well in giving access to water, sanitation, and other things. The issue is that that's on average. Overall, there is actually still an incredible amount of inequality. And those things accumulate over time. So acting early, probably even preschooling, is going to be really important and provide everybody with those opportunities. Then when people achieve the labor market, they face very unequal treatment depending on some innate characteristics and others. Again, here it's really important to address that, to reverse that. And this is really just basically by lowering the barrier to productive employment. And for people that are already in the labor market, also reduce wage inequalities. The wage inequalities are very high, even just between the gender wage inequalities, for example, are very high compared to countries with the same level of income. These things will need to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Pierella. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you very much for those insights. Pierella Paci, she's the practice manager of the Poverty and Equity Group at the World Bank.